Hi, everybody. This is my great pleasure to welcome you to our speaker series. I think this is the first one in 2026, or actually it's the second one. Today's session is going to be on the encryption equation, trust, technology, and the public good. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you in just a moment our speakers for today. As you may know, this is part of a virtual speaker series that is supported by the Knight Foundation. It's part of a transatlantic digital governance for democratic renewal initiative organized by Columbia World Projects and the Center for Digital Governance at the Hertie School, which aims to address the challenges generated by digital platforms for democratic institutions and discourse. Since its launch in September 2023, this Columbia Hertie initiative has brought together over 1,000 digital regulators, technologists, scholars, and civil society advocates to tackle a variety of complex issues, including, for example, improving platform-to-researcher frameworks to better diagnose, expose, and address online harms, developing tools to tackle digital monopolies, exploring new content moderation standards that balance the issues of user privacy, free expression, and community-driven alternatives. And today, Udbhav Tiwari will open this session by offering his thoughts on how we should design and govern digital platforms to stabilize and promote democratic practice. Drawing on his work at Signal, he will discuss the thinking behind Signal's encryption protocol, the real costs of maintaining platform security, and why digital privacy must remain central to the future of technology innovation and governance. And then Susan McGregor will serve as the discussant. And just very briefly, to give you some background of the organizers of this event, Columbia World Projects is an initiative of Columbia University that connects policymakers, practitioners, and researchers to explore pressing issues, including what sustains and ails liberal democracy around the world, while offering focused solutions for revitalizing democracy. And then the Center for Digital Governance at the Hertie School, which is where I'm director of, is a gateway to governance of digital transformation that promotes digitalization where appropriate to improve public well-being. And another co-organizer we are very happy has joined us is Tech Policy Press, which is a nonprofit media and community venture intended to provoke new ideas, debate, and discussion at the intersection of technology and democracy. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you our speakers for today. Udbhav Tiwari is the VP for Strategy and Global Affairs at Signal. Udbhav's experience in the technology sector spans both global and regional contexts, where he was formerly the Director for Global Product Policy at Mozilla, with prior roles at Google and the Center for Internet and Society in India. He has testified before the US Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and has been quoted as an expert by CNN, The Guardian, Wired, Financial Times, BBC, and Reuters. Udbhav was seriously affiliated with the Carnegie Endowment for Peace and was named to India Today's India Tomorrow list in 2020. And Susan McGregor, who is our discussant for today, is a research scholar at Columbia University's Data Science Institute, where she also co-chairs its Center for Data, Media, and Society. She has co-authored a wide range of academic papers and book chapters and is the solo author of 2 books, Information Security Essentials, a guide for reporters, editors, and newsroom leaders that was published with Columbia University Press, and then Practical Python, Data Wrangling and Data Quality. So now I'm going to turn over to Udbhav, who is going to provide a 15 to 20-minute overview of his work. And then, Susan, I'll invite you to come in directly afterwards with your 8 to 10 minutes discussion. So without further ado, Udbhav, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniela, and thank you for all of the organizers for having me and for putting this crucial conversation together in what's clearly a pretty important time for the world. Over the course of the next 15 minutes, I'll broadly be talking about what Signal is and why the way that we are structured, our mission, and the way that we build our technology both set us apart within the technology ecosystem, but also serve as a set of guidelines for how technology can be done right. Then I'll talk a little bit about what are some of the ways in which Signal does innovation in order to further its mission of privacy, talking a little bit about post-quantum and then usernames and phone number privacy as well. And in the last maybe 10 minutes, I'm largely going to be talking about Signal and the global landscape that we broadly face around the world and why just in the push and pull between governments and residents and citizens, there's a very clear recognition of the importance of encryption, but there are many legislative and policy threats that we're facing that are creating significant headwinds, both all around the world, but also in what otherwise might be considered liberal democracies. So maybe I'll start off by talking about Signal and its structure. So Signal is structured as a nonprofit, and this is a fact that not many people who use Signal as the application know. But the reason that we're structured as a nonprofit is we believe that being a nonprofit is a fundamental design choice that makes the technology that we create more reliable and more trustworthy. We don't have quarterly earnings calls demanding that we exploit user data. We don't have venture capitalists breathing down our necks for growth at any cost. We run a very, very small team that's fiercely focused and driven by a shared commitment to our mission. We don't try to boil the ocean in the tech industry, but instead try to build truly private communication by being laser focused on our mission. And that mission is to make private communications accessible, secure, and ubiquitous, not just for the tech savvy, not just for journalists, not just for activists, but for everyone. And this isn't a feature for the sake of being a feature. It's the very reason we exist and the reason that we've had the impact that we do in the world around us, where today more than 3.5 billion people in the world communicate using the Signal protocol. And I'll explain that in a bit as to why that isn't just people who use the Signal application, but also many other large providers in the space that rely on the Signal protocol for carrying out end-to-end encryption. Now, the main thing that really sets Signal apart is the fact that we design our communications and our technical systems to be private, even from ourselves, the service provider, which means that we don't have access to the content of your messages, which is something that exists in many other places. But we also deploy that same end-to-end encryption for call logs, for contacts, for metadata, and a lot of other information that many other service providers tend to make available to themselves and therefore subject to being requested by governments or other entities that might want access to that information. And we've architected our systems so we can't see this information. And at its core, this is the biggest market differentiator that Signal has as a service and sets us apart from our competition and many of our peers. Now, this reputation that Signal enjoys, where if you were to look at numbers, you would see that we have grown quite radically in the past 2 to 3 years, is based on trust. And now that trust is something that in the technology sector, quite often you have to take the name of or take the word of the individual or the organization that's building a particular piece of standard. But that's not true for Signal. Because of our history rooted in both cyberpunk tradition, but also decades of cryptographic research, is open source. And that means that if you go to GitHub, you will find our source code for our applications, as well as source code for things that run on the server side, actually available for anyone to view, vet, and deploy how they want. And Signal is also licensed under something called the GPL or the GNU Public License, which means it is actually possible to deploy Signal in ways that you want it to, as long as you follow the terms of the GPL license directly from GitHub. And this means that transparency is baked into our mission. Anyone can scrutinize our code, and they do. And it is these security researchers that are largely responsible for the reputation that Signal enjoys. Because when we say we don't collect metadata, it's not something that you just need to take our word for, but is in fact something that has been tested and formally verified by both cybersecurity researchers as well as communities writ large. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the ecosystem impact that Signal has had underlined by this ethos and this technological design. So The Signal protocol is actually something that's used, like I mentioned, by over 3.5 billion people around the world. And that's because it's also the underlying basis of other messaging providers, including WhatsApp. So WhatsApp uses the Signal protocol in order to end-to-end encrypt the content of messages, which means that if you send someone an image or a text or a video on WhatsApp, the content of that message itself is end-to-end encrypted using the Signal protocol. The metadata that I mentioned earlier, such as contact list, profile information, group member information, are not end-to-end encrypted by many of these providers, which we do. But the reality is the reason we open source the Signal protocol is A, of course, everything that I mentioned around trust, but B, also because we wanted to make sure that privacy is not proprietary and is a public good, which has led to its broad-based adoption by many in the ecosystem. So, with that, I hope to have illustrated both the ecosystem impact as well as the ethos and mission that drive Signal's day to day operations. Now, I'll talk a little bit about what are some of the ways in which Signal has been innovating in this space. Last year, we actually launched a pretty significant step towards decoupling identity from phone numbers. This means that it is possible for individuals on Signal to create usernames and make usernames their primary identifier on the service. And that's because while phone numbers are necessary for us, to be able to combat spam, this allows us to make sure that users have greater and granular control over how they are identified on the platform, as well as how others on the platform can identify users when they are talking or messaging with them. And this is something that is still quite unique for Signal and for a service that's actually based on phone numbers. And we are seeing fairly rapid adoption of this feature for people who care about privacy, especially in contexts like public groups. Then there's also post-quantum cryptography, where the threat of quantum computers rendering current encryption levels obsolete is quite real, and even if it's not immediate. And Signal hasn't been waiting. We've already rolled out upgrades to our protocol, which we call PQXDH. That's PQXDH, which I would invite you to look up, to protect messages that are being sent today from the quantum computers of tomorrow. And the specific protection that this provides is from harvest now and decrypt later attacks, which means that adversaries could potentially harvest messages today that they cannot read because they're end-to-end encrypted. But at the point at which quantum computers reach the stage that they can actually start interacting with these encrypted messages and break into them due to the power of quantum computers, post-quantum encryption would help protect many of these messages from such adversarial attacks as well. We've slowly started rolling it out into the entire message flow within Signal. And while these protections are available today for many of our users by default, there is still a fair bit of work that we would need to do in order to make sure that this isn't just something that Signal does, but is actually a protection available to many other users of other platforms that use the Signal protocol as well, because there are not just there are some serious technical challenges to being able to deploy it in contexts like messaging where people expect instantaneous responses. With that, I hope to have told you a little bit about how Signal also innovates in this space and what are some of the changes that we've made in order to adapt to the threats that many of our users face today. And with that, I'd like to move on to talking about how we see the world re-large and why we believe that what Signal does with encryption often ends up serving as a front line for privacy. It's very clear that there's a growing and palpable discomfort with the pervasive surveillance and data exploitation that we see around us. Organizations and individuals alike are waking up to the fact that fundamental rights are being debated and potentially bargained away. And when doing so, they're actively seeking alternatives that protect their digital autonomy. The growth that we see in the adoption of privacy preserving tools like Signal, but also other tools like Proton in the ecosystem is much more than just about downloading an app. It's an indicator ultimately of societies questioning the direction that they are being taken in. And as a constituency, they're actively choosing tools that respect their dignity in the face of an expanding surveillance state. It also tells us that the demand for genuine privacy is real, but is becoming a peaceful and powerful form of resistance against the deployment of surveillance technologies into our daily lives. And while this is the ecosystem that we face and the political reality that we face, the reality is that many governments are not happy with this taking place. And this is happening because of two main reasons. The first is that Signal is quite regularly subject to what we sometimes like to call asymmetric warfare, where many of our peers and competitors are companies with near limitless resources whose entire business models are often dependent on surveillance capitalism. They set the defaults, they own the platforms, they control the app stores, and the only way that we can compete with them is not with money, but with better principles and verifiable security. Ensuring that access to signal does not become limited is a key priority and one we do not take lightly, as you can see from many of the efforts that we carry out in order to implement censorship circumvention within the application itself. And then there is what's happening on the policy front, where across the globe we are facing many direct threats to privacy. Governments are advocating for legislation that would force encrypted messaging services like ours, but also others, to build backdoors, allowing authorities to access user communications. These proposals often mandate that we retain messages and provide law enforcement with message history. Proponents argue that such measures are necessary for investigations, and that is often called, in policy parlance, the going dark problem. We've always been absolutely clear. There is no such thing as a backdoor only for the good guys. A vulnerability for one is a vulnerability for all, and you cannot build a secure house and hand a key to the police that you hope no one else will ever be able to copy. It's both a technical impossibility and a grave risk given the vital and sensitive communications that take place on applications like Signal every day. And this isn't just a view that we share. Cybersecurity experts, our peers in the tech industry, and even defense and intelligence agencies, such as those in Sweden and Netherlands, have warned that implementing such access mechanisms would introduce systemic security risks that could be exploited by unauthorized parties, that in the case of nation states also include hostile foreign powers. Our president, Meredith Whittaker, has unequivocally stated our position. If legislation requires Signal to undermine our privacy promises by introducing a backdoor, we would rather withdraw from any market rather than comply with such obligations. We will not compromise the integrity of our technology or the safety of the millions of people who rely on us in the response to such technically unfeasible threats. It's a very dangerous survival of a zombie argument that we must weaken security for everyone in order to supposedly create security for some. It's a threat, and we must fight against these measures, which include things like client-side scanning, when content can be scanned on your device before it is encrypted, which many governments claim is a form of end-to-end encryption, which we think negates the very purpose of encryption. We're also seeing measures in Europe around data retention in the EU Protect strategy that pretty clearly is backing encrypted messaging providers into a corner and might even force them ultimately to carry out forms of data retention that will similarly negate encryption. We fight many of these battles around the world on behalf of our users and are joined often by both peers in the industry and civil society. And it's a battle we hope to keep fighting because it's clear that we have something really valuable to defend. In the last minute, I'd very briefly like to talk a little bit about something that we're also seeing around agentic AI. The rapid and often reckless deployment of AI presents a drastic and almost unimaginable threat to secure communications like Signal. We often use the example of Microsoft Recall, a local always on screen system that takes screenshots of your screens every few seconds and stores it on your device in order to be able to respond to search queries. So, for example, if you were to say, when was I looking at a yellow car last month, you would literally get a screenshot that would show you when you were on a web page looking for a yellow car. But the problem is that in collecting these images and running optical character recognition or OCR on them, you are also creating a honeypot of extraordinarily sensitive information. And we also saw just in the last 2 weeks with the deployment of Claudebot and with the deployment of agentic systems that these risks are not just limited to operating systems, but can also be exercised via applications where people willingly give up their privacy. While all of these systems are marketed for user benefit, it actually exemplifies a very dangerous trend towards comprehensive and inescapable digital surveillance. If these systems cannot distinguish between sensitive information that, say, is within Signal or your banking application or your health application from information that users might be comfortable storing, they will ultimately end up creating far more harm than good. And which is why today on Windows 11 for Microsoft Recall, if you download Signal, then screenshots are automatically blocked. While that may seem like it solves the problem, the reality is this poses serious concerns for users that might indulge in using NDA, which is a screen reader for visually impaired users, or other legitimate use cases where people do want to be able to take screenshots within Signal. This idea that every single digital interaction should be recorded and indexed in order for an AI to be able to serve you is a very serious risk to privacy, and is one that we have increasingly begun to fight in order to protect the privacy of our users. Now, Signal is ultimately and should be understood as critical public interest technology. In places where fundamental rights are currently being threatened in the highest halls of power, its role has never been more vital. We must recognize Signal's value and the value of privacy and encryption, resist every attempt to undermine it, and foster an ecosystem where such technologies can thrive independent of the surveillance for-profit motive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Udbhav. Yes, and Susan, please jump right in.
Thank you. I sort of don't know where to begin. I mean, there's so much in this, and I have to say, I am fortunate to be, I think, probably a very early user of Signal. I recall a time when there was something called Text Secure, which I think was an early precursor to Signal, and it's something that I am grateful to have been able to use for well over a decade. You presented a lot of really interesting information, and I think I'd like to talk a little bit about some of kind of the technical and political aspects, because I think those are really important. And I think some of what you described highlights, challenges for the general public sometimes around understanding the distinction between, as you noted, the kind of services and protection that Signal can offer and is working to enhance versus, the kinds of things that you might see offered by either other services or described in other ways. I actually want to come back because I think this is very important, actually, is to the financial aspect. Thinking about Signal as a nonprofit, I'm reminded of a piece written over a decade ago now by a former colleague of mine, Julia Engwin, about another piece of encryption software, which was, for those who are not familiar, which was around encrypted email. And it was an email application known as Pretty Good Privacy. I can drop a link to the piece in the chat here. And basically, this is a piece of software that had been in existence for a long time. And many people relied upon, if they relied upon encrypted email. And it was being maintained by a single person who was not being paid for his work. He was essentially unable to support his family because he was maintaining this software that was being used by, large companies, individuals, many people, who legitimately couldn't necessarily afford to pay for it, but a lot of people and organizations that could. And so, as somebody who, comes from a journalism background and thinks a lot about sort of how do we keep these, there you go, how do we keep these, as you point out, really critical public infrastructure services, public interest systems going. A lot of, and again, for anyone in the room who might not be aware of this, a lot of the infrastructure of the internet is actually based on open source technology. So major commercial companies actually base a lot of, including things like the Signal protocol, but even more things that we might consider more fundamental are based on open source technologies. And I'm wondering, I realize this is maybe doesn't feel precisely on topic, but is there an opportunity to kind of create a financial model that helps essentially charge those organizations that can afford it, in some way to help keep this financially sustainable? Because as you say, there's huge asymmetry in what the kind of organization that Signal is, what it's trying to do and protect, and the resources and interests that are in many ways arrayed against it, whether it's from commercial entities, from governments, things like that. So I'm really curious, what I don't know if Signal has a position on this, but I think this is an area of innovation that we face in a lot of areas that ultimately serve the public interest, but don't necessarily, but because they serve the public interest, are not going to essentially charge at a retail level for what they provide.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's definitely something that I think we think about a lot, right? And what I will do is for the folks who are attending the webinar, I've just dropped a link in the chat. And for the folks who are not, you can just look up a blog post that says Signal is expensive, but privacy is priceless, which we put out about 2 years ago. And it's actually, I think, both Signal's official position on the question that you just asked, Susan, but also actually breaks down how much does it cost to run Signal? What are the kinds of expenses that we have? What are the kinds of things that we need to, spend money on in order to be able to retain talent and build technology that can provide instantaneous communication at the scale at which we do? And in that post, but also generally, you would see that Signal currently approaches it largely by having a model that largely focuses on donations, which gives us a fair amount of independence from market pressures. But it's also pretty clear that that model can scale in some ways, maybe for applications like Signal, that have recall, word of mouth, and general adoption in society. But with the very legitimate example that you gave of PGP, it's something that so many people, I'm sure, were just using on their software and just didn't have any idea that this was even something that a person was working on. And I think in terms of the solutions to the idea, we are seeing some pretty interesting initiatives. There's always, of course, been the Linux Foundation, and they have a core security initiative that funds essential software. A lot of this got created after the Heartbleed SSL vulnerability, maybe about, I think, 8 years ago now. But we are also seeing models, particularly in Germany, of the Sovereign Tech Agency, which is an organization that's actually been set up by the German government in order to help maintain critical public infrastructure and funds developers working on critical software all around the world, pays for security audits, and does many things to help maintain such software. We've also seen similar models, I think, be created in the United States with the Open Technology Fund, which in fact also has supported a lot of vital software like Tor and others in the space with money as well. But it's increasingly clear that that is a one-off approach to something that is clearly a far deeper and systemic problem. And we do need to start, I think, as societies, acknowledging the fact that if we are relying on critical infrastructure and aren't supporting them at the scale that they require, then we are just creating avenues either for them to be replaced by less privacy preserving and more surveillance prone commercial alternatives, or we're going to rely on the fact that if you work in certain sectors that are nonprofit, then it's okay. And there's an expectation that you should not be able to live, a comfortable life if you're working on such software because of the fact that you're working for a nonprofit. So it's a complicated question. And I think ultimately, wherever we come up will be a combination of what is a shared responsibility, governments playing their role, corporations that rely on these technologies playing their role, and citizens also contributing to the software that they use in terms of finances. And it's something that we really hope happens for many more pieces of software and not just Signal.
Thank you. I think I more want to use the remaining few minutes that I have to kind of add a couple of plugs for some of the topics that you touched on that I think, again, depending on who's in the audience, may or may not, folks may not necessarily be aware of some of the history. So I think one of the things that, and actually to touch on something that I see came up in the Q&A, I think what you mentioned about what Germany is working on, right, goes to this question of data sovereignty and digital sovereignty, right, which is the ability for, communities and regions and nation states and whatever to be able to exercise control over the data that is moving through them. Relying on commercial entities and things like this is never going to provide that kind of stable opportunity in the way that supporting the kind of critical infrastructure that Signal represents does. I think I also want to touch on, I know that often moderation and as you pointed out, what we would sometimes is called exceptional access, this idea that privacy is all well and good and we want it for private individuals, but there are bad actors who are going to exploit it, right? And we see this, we know client-side scanning is part of this. There's lots of there's legislation, all over the world, right? And it comes up periodically to essentially require that law enforcement be able to access private communications. This is a very old debate. And so this is actually something that goes back 30, 40 years in the history of encryption. Some people would refer to sort of the encryption wars of the 1990s. And I would really encourage folks to look at an excellent paper, very readable, that was published about a decade ago by essentially a collection of the absolute leading lights and some of the most experienced and venerable folks in security and privacy. It's called Keys Under Doormats, and essentially elaborates on the comment that Udbhav made about you cannot create a key that is only accessible to the good guys. It's simply not possible, right? I think there's sometimes this difficulty with technical systems where the idea that we can say, oh, only the right people can access it. And I was looking for an additional reference, but the fact is, if it can be accessed, it can be accessed. Nothing can be protected perfectly. No key can be perfectly protected. And as a result, if you mandate exceptional access, you are guaranteeing the insecurity of the entire system. That may seem like a hard trade-off, but I would point out that this is actually a trade-off that in many regions we've made over and over again in favor of privacy. So one of the things I like to harken back to, I'm from the United States and located there, is that actually one of the most important and comprehensive pieces of legislation in the founding of the United States was the U.S. Postal Act of 1792. The privacy and security of the mails was one of the most important issues that the founders of the United States concentrated on. And it was because surveillance of the Royal Mails was so typical and so commonplace that they created their own communication channels in order to be able to build a republic. And that philosophy, that understanding that, yes, of course, private communication can make it possible for bad actors to communicate privately, but that risk is counterbalanced and overwhelmed really by the importance of allowing privacy and security for the population as a whole. And, I'd be happy to, if appropriate, I can share my views on where some of the other kind of concerns come from about having these kinds of private communications be widely available. But the fact is they reflect a very innate human trend, right? We see time and again in history and in communities the desire for privacy. Communities that develop languages, slangs, all of this stuff. We want to be able to communicate with one another in a way that is safe from others who are outside of our context or outside of our community. This is a very, very natural and easily documentable human desire. And so this idea that communities don't want privacy or people don't really care about it, really is marketing for, the companies, agencies that believe that compromising that is important for the work or the business model that they have. The last thing that I just would like to share with the group is, this is an advanced version, but you can find this also about a decade ago, going back years here, but I think these are really just such valuable references. So David Kaye was the UN Special Rapporteur on encryption in 2014 and 2015 and published a paper on this. And I think another thing that is often feels like a subject of tension when we think about the importance of end-to-end encryption is that often it gets tied to this idea of freedom of expression, right? And we know that freedom of expression has different interpretations and different gradations in countries and regions and communities around the world. I think what's so crucial about David's work in this point is that he ties it not, and I think this is very real, he ties it not to the idea of freedom of expression, but the right to form an opinion, that the ability for us to have private thoughts, to record, to reflect, right? Writing is one of the key things that makes humans distinct from other creatures on this earth, and our ability to document, to reflect, to share is part of how we become who we are. If we live in a world, and this is the kind of thing that research has documented, where we always know that what we write, what we share, what we do can be revealed, we become different people. And I think that recognizing the importance of being able to use our communication services, our devices to access information, to learn and to grow in a safe, private and independent way is really, for me, at the real core of this. Yes, communication with others is important, but it goes much deeper than that. And I think to me that also kind of reflects the final point you were making, Udbhav, about these agentic AI systems that are being integrated everywhere. There's kind of the tangible security risks that we can recognize of, now my private details about my health, my bank accounts, my contacts, all of these things. But there's also something I think much more insidious, which is just this understanding that nothing I do is truly just for me. And that somewhere it can always be collected and judged and categorized, and that produces a very different feeling and a very different capacity. And I will say, as an educator, this is something that I feel very strongly about, because as we try to provide people with the resources to grow and learn and become who they want to be, it is stifling for them to feel that they cannot do that in a safe and private way. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much. I look forward to the comments and questions.
And Udbhav, why don't you, if you want to, respond to some of the other issues that Susan mentioned, if you want to, and then we will start the Q&A.
Thank you. I mean, maybe I would just say, apart from agreeing with Susan, I think that there's also this pretty critical distinction that I think that we need to have in terms of how social media platforms operate and how private messaging services operate. When it comes to social media platforms, I think it's increasingly clear that the expectations that society have of what you can do on them, as well as the obligations that should apply on them, are quite different from the expectations that people have on private messaging when it comes to being able to talk to individuals in a way that no one else can see. And the reality remains that the actual question that we ask ourselves every time we talk about exceptional access and every time we talk about content moderation is really, should it be possible for a state to always be able to intervene in what a citizen does on their devices, right? And that's the problem with things like client-side scanning, which is that everybody says you can do client-side scanning and see things that and then prevent bad things from happening before they happen. Or you can do, in some weird hypothetical future when homomorphic encryption is also available on devices, that you can perform content moderation on encrypted services. But the reality is that encryption is something that is protecting your ability of other people from finding out whether they can, or finding out what you're talking about, whether that they find out what you're talking about inside the system by breaking encryption, by scanning it before it's done, or by not breaking encryption at all, but still always being able to find out what you've done. It will always lead to situations where states will abuse that power in the way that we've already seen them abuse the power that they already have, even in non-encrypted context. So I just like maybe add that as an additional point to what Susan said as a plus one. And I also think it will help us answer many of the questions that we have coming in on the chat as well as the Q&A.
Great. And before we start the Q&A, so I invite you to raise your virtual hand and share with us who you are on video. But I noted that there are several questions already here in the chat, which I will refer to also in just a moment. But as you're thinking about questions, maybe I'll start the discussion with a question that also relates to the broader theme of this speaker series, which is also aimed at identifying some of the new ways of governance that can help to promote democracy as we're thinking about democratic renewal. And so, Udbhav, I think there was also sometimes it was a little bit in between the lines. And so I would like to invite you a little bit more to think about potential governance implications, especially because sort of where I'm located, I'm in Berlin, and also in the European Union, there have been now a difference has been made between the very large online platforms and the online platforms. And when I talk to European policymakers about this distinction between platforms, I believe Signal would be an online platform according to this distinction. And essentially, it's based on user numbers inside the European Union. So you qualify as a VLOP, very large online platform, if you if your users are over 10% inside the European Union. But when I talked to European policymakers about this, they said to me, it's kind of almost like a regulatory sandbox without calling it that way. But it essentially means that the very large online platforms, they have greater obligations, and that there is therefore subject to a number of additional sort of process-based governance measures, while the online platforms that tend to have then lower number or percentages of users inside the European Union are still regulated, but to a lesser extent. And so I was just wondering whether sort of where you see, maybe not specifically also Signal, but kind of the kinds of services that also Signal stands for, because there are a number of also, alternative services. Wire is a Berlin-based application. There are a number of alternatives out there. Whether you think this is the sort of multi-platform governance structure is helpful to promote democracy, or whether you would envision something completely different, perhaps.
No, for sure. I think that's a good question because it also gets into, I think, the point that I'd made earlier about private messaging and social media networks. So, for example, the law that creates the distinction that you just mentioned around, large online platforms and very large online platforms is the Digital Services Act at the European level. And at the European level, the Digital Services Act contains an explicit exemption for encrypted messaging providers as long as they don't start providing services that are considered to be social in nature. And we've actually seen this whole loop play out just in the last 2-3 weeks, because the Commission very recently notified the channels feature within WhatsApp as being a very large online platform. I think this was literally maybe 10-12 days ago. And even in that announcement, you would see that they made the distinction and they said it's this channels feature that is the VLOP. And the parts of WhatsApp that are individuals communicating with each other or fully controlled groups are not subject to like those obligations. And I think that is a good distinction to be able to create, because it's pretty clear that that there should be a certain amount of responsibility that comes with a certain amount of scale. But it's also the technical nature of the platform that I think already in European law, well before the DSA, governs the kinds of obligations that people were subject to, right? All the way back to the e-commerce directive in the European Union. There was also then a distinction between, say, dumb pipe intermediaries like ISPs and network providers whose only job was to send something from point A to point B, and others who actually played a role in moderating that content. And that's a distinction that I think we see all around the world. If you look at laws in India, the United States, in Malaysia, in Australia, all of them call it different things, but almost all of them are moving towards this world where the kind of function you perform is you being used to determine the kind of obligations that should apply to you. I do think that we are at a stage where we are pretty uncharted territory. Like a lot of these legislations, especially the more detailed ones like the Digital Services Act, have literally been in force like for a couple of years now. And we're seeing that the consequence of how they've been implemented has enabled greater public transparency and greater access to information that has allowed independent researchers, academics, and governments to be able to understand how these platforms work better. So in that regard, I think it is definitely a good thing. I think that like just like with the DSA, there is also the Online Safety Act in the United Kingdom, and we've seen a lot of, I think, very valid criticism emerge from civil society that has criticized some of the obligations present within the Online Safety Act, even though it is another law that creates platform accountability obligations at the end of the day. So I think it's very much a process that will have to play out on a case-by-case basis, and we will have to see how courts in that respective country think that a law like that fits within the broader paradigm of the laws and regulations that exist in that country and the constitution ultimately in that country. And at the same time, you also have countries like China, where effectively it's almost impossible to provide encrypted services without the permission of the state. We were restricted, I think, for the first time in China maybe 2.5 years ago, which is kind of surprising, right? Because we're an end-to-end encrypted messaging app, and we were pretty well known in 2.5 years ago as well. So the fact that that's how late it took also showcases that there's clearly an element of like what sometimes looks like an iceberg, right? Like what you see on top of the water and what is under the water are quite different. And Sometimes the situation that leads to it flipping can be like a political development, an attack, a scandal inside a country that suddenly shines a spotlight on a platform that then like motivates certain kinds of action. So I think that we ultimately will continue to be a little reactive on this, but net, I think almost all of the measures around trying to hold large social media platforms distinct from messaging platforms are largely quite positive.
Thank you for your interesting take on that. So I have a couple of questions here on my list. I'm going to start with the one by Emily Osborne. What about current frameworks like the Cloud Act and Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act? Do these present any risk to encrypted communications today? Is encryption enough to guarantee data sovereignty?
Thank you. I think it's a good question, and one, as you can imagine, we get asked quite frequently. What I will do is maybe do two things. One, just drop a link into the everyone section so that people can see it, which is a website. And for the folks who are watching this later, signal.org/bigbrother. Which is the place where when we have received legal valid requests that have gone through a court process in the United States, we actually ask for the orders that demanding that we share X or Y, Z information to be unsealed so that we can create public proof of both what these requests ask for us and what we are able to give back to them. So with that context of like the sort of citation for everything I'm about to say is on signal.org/bigbrother. Laws like the Cloud Act and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act require platforms or organizations to share data that they have. These laws don't require people to collect data that they are not collecting today, which means that if Signal were to get such a request, as you can see on signal.org/bigbrother, there are only three pieces of information that we have been able to share so far are if that phone number exists on Signal, something anyone can find out, whether the date on which that account was created and the date on which the account last connected to the service, and nothing else. No contacts, no profile name, no profile information, no photo, right? So this means for platforms like ours, the Cloud Act and FISA place much lesser of an obligation because we don't have the data to share in the first place. If the same question were to be, say, applied to WhatsApp, or if it were to be applied to Telegram, or if it were to be applied to Facebook messages, I think we would see that the answer would be different for each of those platforms because it is about how much data they actually end up collecting. So encryption alone is definitely not a guarantee for data sovereignty because you can't encrypt everything, because if you encrypt everything, then it'll be very hard for certain technical systems to operate. But it can help you make sure that you're collecting as little data as possible so that when it comes to privacy, you are protecting the privacy of the participants in that conversation rather than the interests of the state that may want to access that information.
I was just going to say, sometimes this is described as data minimization, right? So there is sort of, and by the way, this applies in a personal context to the less data you have, the less it's at risk. And so that philosophy, just to underscore that point, that philosophy is really important for businesses and, for companies and individuals. If you don't have it, you can't give it up.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's another question by Owen Bennett, whether user-facing trust and safety efforts are possible in end-to-end encrypted environments without jeopardizing the commitment to privacy of users and integrity of the service.
Thank you. I think that's a really good question. And I think that the answer is absolutely yes, right? Like, so for example, even on a platform like Signal that collects as little metadata as we do for fraud, every time a new user gets in touch with you, there's actually a warning that says this person is not in your contacts. Please be careful about anything or talking to them. And you explicitly have to click on accept before you can start talking to them. If in that first message they send any link, that link is not clickable. So you can't click on a link before reading that warning and, like say, be a part of a phishing scam or a phishing attack. There are also ways within the application where imagine a person is getting in touch with you for the first time. There's actually a section that we have now that says groups in common, so that you can see if this individual who's claiming to be who they are is actually also present in other groups that you are a part of them, which especially when people tend to be impersonating, people who you're familiar with. Because imagine I just get another get another phone number, call myself Susan McGregor, and send you, Daniela, a message. It'll be quite hard for you to say, like, is it the real Susan McGregor? Because I just named myself whatever I wanted on the platform. So there are other avenues that we provide for users to be able to verify their social graphs the way that they exist within the messaging platform in order to prevent fraud. I think that there are definitely certain limitations because ultimately, I think it's really hard to perform the full spectrum of trust and safety without also having access to the content. Because if you don't have access to the content, it's really, really hard to imagine a world in which you can pass judgments on whether someone is doing something wrong or not. And it is the intrinsic nature of end-to-end encryption to prevent the platform from even having access to that information. Because if you do that, then suddenly all of the other benefits of encryption go away. And there are ways in which we take that obligation quite seriously, right? Which is, so for example, Signal doesn't have a directory search. It doesn't have a channels feature. It doesn't have the ability to search for users with partial usernames or with partial phone numbers. We make sure that our groups can't go above a particular size. Like the reason we don't have a communities feature, the reason that we haven't built these features is because we recognize that there is a responsibility that comes from developing and deploying an encrypted platform that's different from a social media platform. So quite often, a lot of those TNS measures are in fact things we don't do rather than things we do in order to be able to protect our users.
And there was a related question, which is about the credibility or verifying the credibility of users on the platform. And the question is, what are some of the verification checks that Signal adopts to ascertain the credibility of the user? So it's about authenticity of the user on the platform.
Absolutely. Pretty simple answer, none at all. For a platform that has been designed to collect as little user data as possible, as you can imagine, any data that we collect to determine the authenticity of the platform is also data that will be subpoenable and is going to be information that we have to share. We don't have the ability to verify users on the platform. The only thing that a user can do is we do have something called security numbers, which is a code that is the same on your phone and the same on my phone when we are talking to each other to verify that you're talking to the right person. If you verify that number, there's an option for a user to mark a user as verified. So, for example, imagine, Daniela, you and I meet whenever I'm in New York next. I could make you, or when we meet in Berlin, I could like take the phone and say, okay, this is our numbers are right, let's mark you as verified. That is an individual one-to-one verification, which means that verification doesn't do anything for you talking to, say, Susan or to anyone else. It just means that on our chat, I am sure that this person is the person that they are claiming to be. But apart from that, we don't carry out any other verification because in order to do so, we would have to collect like arguably the most sensitive data that exists about a user, which is identity information, right? Like we'll have to ask them to say, like, give us a scan of your passport to be able to determine that you are this person with a photo, with a name, and with a bunch of other things, which of course social media platforms do for legitimate reasons, but it's something that Signal, in order to practice its principle of data minimization, like Susan said, definitely does not do.
Susan, would you like to come in on these points as well?
Yes, if I may, I just briefly, I would say that I think that one of the challenges sometimes in these conversations is when we talk about things like security, we're often talking about two related but distinct issues. As I mentioned in the chat, one is encryption, which is the protection of the information, and the other is authentication, which goes to the previous question, right? How do I know that the person I'm talking to is the person I think they are? And the short version for that, and it's not just Signal, it's really any platform, if we think about it, right, is using other information. The point with Signal and other encrypted platforms is that, you don't have a profile picture. You're not looking at the other photos and saying, oh, this is the friend of a friend that I met at the party the other day, and I believe that it's them, right? And so that process of authentication, of verifying that the person is who you think they are, is really always with you as the individual, right? We just, in other platforms, sometimes have different methods of doing that. I think I also wanted to just be, I would like to sort of address the comment or the question about trust and safety, because it was brought up in the chat. I think personally, just to sort of add to Beth's comment, that focusing on platforms as the sort of patrollers of content is, in my opinion at least, absolutely the wrong end of the pipe, right? In other words, what we're talking about when we talk about explicit material and many of the things that a lot of these legislative pieces are focused on, it's focusing on the transmission, which is after the problem has happened. Okay. And so realistically, if we want to talk about governance and kind of dealing with those situations, that's something that needs to be happening long before somebody gets to a platform like Signal or a social media, anything like that, right? That's not the place where you can deal with those issues. And I think it's I understand why it's tempting. But the fact of the matter is that if you want to deal with things like abusive material, you have to be dealing with it where it's happening, and it's not happening on the platforms. That's where it's being transmitted. So just my +1 on that.
Thank you for that point, or those 2 points. We have time for a last question, which follows up on our previous discussion about governance as well. The question is, what is Signal's perspective on the EU chat control legislation as it currently is proposed, and what would the obligations look like if this legislation is passed?
Thank you. So fortunately, there was some good news late last year on chat control, where the governments in the European Council decided to adopt a position that made client-side scanning voluntary rather than mandatory. It's still there in the law, but it's something that platforms can endeavor to do rather than have to do. But as a part of that compromise, I think that there are a bunch of other obligations that are now on the table as well, including some concerns around age verification, where there are some rumors that there is going to be language that will say that in order to be able to use end-to-end encrypted platforms like Signal, you would have to be above a particular age. And there are rumors that that age would be 16 or 18 as well. And I think, and therefore you would have to literally verify your identity, make sure that you're above an age, and then be able to use end-to-end encryption. There are many ways I think that can be deeply problematic, especially in cases where vulnerable populations use end-to-end encryption in order to get the privacy they need in order to be able to communicate within their communities. You can imagine an LGBTQ child in a community where it's not okay to be someone who has that as an identity, using encryption in order to be able to get help, talk to other people from that community, and in a sense, discover themselves. And what we would say is that that is a right that you cannot exercise until you either prove you're above a particular age or that you have the permission of your parent, which in many of these communities, including in big liberal democracies, is something that would end up being quite risky. So I don't think that the risks within chat control are entirely gone. There are many obligations like the age verifications one that I think will actually be negotiated over the course of this year. I would say that our red line was definitely client-side scanning, and that's something that's not there in the legislation or mandatory as of the last draft, but the law has not passed yet either. So if it does pass, it's definitely a strong red line for us, and we would try to be there for our users as much as possible. But if we have to choose between the two, we would definitely never fall on the side of participating in or conducting client-side scanning.
Thank you so much to both of you for sharing with us today your insights into these absolutely important topics. I learned a lot. Some of the takeaway points for me from this conversation is, first of all, oftentimes there's this discussion about encryption and privacy is considered to be or branded or maybe framed as a trade-off, right? So you can't it's a trade-off to have more private and more end-to-end encryption versus being able as governments to control those sort of spaces, communication spaces. And I think you made a very good point that this is not necessarily a trade-off. And then the other takeaway point from this conversation for me is also this the discussion we're having about multi-level governance approaches. And I don't know whether the European approach is is necessarily suitable for all contexts, but it's definitely an interesting multi-level governance approach for for further discussion, also related to these topics. So thank you so much, Udbhav and Susan, for joining us. And thanks to the audience for also asking fantastic questions and for sharing all this rich information in the chat. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a great day, everybody.